Hey everyone, it's been a while. Welcome back to Little Firefly Artworks. In today's video, I will be masking the rosella so that I can finally finish off the background. And my wrist was still a little bit sore when I was recording this, but I made sure to take plenty of breaks. I probably should have been resting it, but I was so close to finishing this artwork that I literally just could not wait to see it done. Now, the first thing I do when painting with watercolour is mask the edges of the paper so that I have a clean line when I'm done. I'm not actually sure why I started doing this. I think it was back in my visual art diary days. I wanted the artworks to have a little frame around them, and it also kind of helped to protect the other pages in my visual art diaries from getting ruined with paint on them. But I kept doing it even when I started using individual sheets of watercolour paper. I recently discovered that it's actually a beneficial thing to do because it makes it so much easier for someone to frame it. And this is because instead of having to get a backboard and mounting the artwork to the backboard, you can mount the artwork to the matting that provides a little bit of space between the artwork itself and the frame. So it's going to be something that I continue to do, and I would definitely recommend you guys doing this if you ever intend to have your artworks framed at some point. I wasn't entirely sure how I wanted to go about masking the bird when I started, but I knew that I didn't want to put tape directly over the drawing because I tried that in my last video, and when I pulled the tape up off of the rosella's foot, it actually pulled pigment with it. It's not really something I could notice when I looked at the artwork itself, but I didn't want to risk taping up the entire bird and then having noticeable places where pigment had been pulled. So I decided that I was going to trace an outline of the rosella onto a sheet of baking paper, cut that out, and then stick that down over the bird to protect it from the masking tape, which seems very involved, and it was very involved. When I was taping down the protective baking paper, once I'd cut it out, I tried to make sure I kept the tape as close to the bird as I possibly could, because I'd obviously have to come back through later and touch up any areas where the masking tape was. And in the past, when I have used either masking fluid or masking tape to section off an area that I don't want colour to go down on, it has always ended up having a really harsh line around it that you can see even after you've done touch-ups. And I also knew, because I was going to be mixing the colours for this background, it's really hard to get the colour tone and saturation of the colour exactly the same if you have to go back and mix it again. I initially planned to only tape the baking paper down around the edges, which I was doing at the start, since the baking paper itself is water retarding. But apparently, because my masking tape is cheap, it's also masking tape retarding. So I ended up having to go completely overboard, which I was trying to not have to do, and tape down the entire piece of baking paper so that the tape that I put around the edges would actually stick to it. And I probably could have just used a piece of normal paper in the end, but anyway. I cut the tape in half in some spots to limit the overhang and borrowed, quote unquote, my husband's hobby knife to lift and trim some of the tape because my acrylic fingernails are hopeless at trying to lift anything. I am so glad that I stopped getting them after I got married, never getting them again, even though they'd make my hands look really pretty. The tape did lift in a few spots, so I just kind of obsessively went around making sure that water was definitely not going to get in. My biggest concern was I was going to do the background and take off the masking tape and then the bird would be ruined. That would just really not be a good thing. Before I put any pigment or paint or anything down on paper with watercolour painting, I always lightly moisten the paper. And I had to swap brushes here because my wash brush, which is what I was using to start with, was wetting the paper way too much. Prepping the paper this way always allows for the pigment to disperse nicely, and it gives it a really nice, like, aperture effect, I suppose. Kind of makes the background look out of focus. I do really wish I had had a wider brush when I did this. I'm using Winsor & Newton's Cotman series. I started with 3 colours: Hooker's Green Light, White, and Yellow Ochre. I need to look up how to pronounce that word. That's another one that I don't normally say out loud, and in my head I read it as orcha, which is definitely not how you pronounce the word. So I was close. It's Yellow Ochre. I knew I wanted to have a blend of a few different pigments, mainly greens, and I really want it to look soft and out of focus, like I said before. So I try actually using a circular motion to brush the pigment in and to kind of help it spread out a bit, because I thought that would help create the look I was after. Watching the video now, I can see that my plan to lightly moisten the paper was completely disregarded. There's a few spots I can see that it's proper drenched. I didn't realise that at the time, obviously. I'm using the wash and flat brushes inappropriately here, but when I was filming this video, I only had 3 brushes. Now I have 4, which is still not enough. Painting with watercolour on an angled surface is ill-advised, but I was already in this deep and I didn't really want to go through the process of having to completely change how my camera was rigged and move everything around, make space to have it flat, and I just put it in the too hard basket, so I kind of had to do what I had to do. So I made sure that I had plenty of paper towel and chucks handy, and anytime the colour would run too much, I accidentally discovered a pretty cool way to create a little bit of texture by dabbing the paper when the pigment's still wet with paper towel. It doesn't just lift water off the page, it actually lifts the pigment off the page, and then when the pigment spreads because the paper's still wet, it creates some really cool textures, which I'm definitely going to use later. Before painting this piece, when I kind of decided I wanted to try using watercolour as an adult, I had purchased the Kuretake Gansai Tambi palette, and I painted this stunning, don't really want to talk myself up that much. I painted this as a gift for one of my colleagues whose baby's due date was in July. And I decided to, as a congratulatory gift, give her a painting of larkspur, which is the birth flower for July babies. I pretty much exclusively used the Kuretake Gansai Tempei palette. The paints themselves were beautiful and well pigmented, but I wanted to experience having a little bit more freedom to mix my own pigments and to basically relive when I explored watercolour way back in 2010 when I was in grade 8. My dad had a bunch of old Frank Clark DVDs, and I kind of went through a bit of a phase where I watched a few of them and tried to paint a few of them, and this is one of said paintings that I still possess. Hopefully my skills have grown a bit since then. And then I wanted to try something I actually saw on the internet recently. Well, not recently. Recently when I was doing this. And it was basically the way that different minerals, and obviously solvents, but I don't own any solvents, interact with watercolour paint. This specific one was salt. So I grabbed some salt from the kitchen and sprinkled a little bit on just to see if it would help give the really light areas a bit of texture. I then added turquoise to my palette because I wanted to have more vivid greens and more variation between shades of green that were a little bit on the cooler side. I also added burnt sienna so that I could add some warmer tones around the branch that the rosella's clinging to. I'm stippling it on kind of randomly, but I had an idea of where I wanted the darker patches of colour to be, so I'm kind of following the path of imaginary branches, I'd say, because you can't see them. Now, I know most artists follow rules when it comes to creating a piece, and there's a certain way that you have to go about things to help the viewer's eye get drawn in. I'm obviously not following that here. I'm just going with my gut and winging it, and personally I think it works. I think one of the things that I enjoyed the most about working with watercolour here was blotching and letting the paper absorb the pigment to make different shapes with it. I really liked the way that the paper itself creates a really interesting texture and shape out of the pigment if you just let it absorb it. And then came the moment of truth, removing the masking. There's something about removing the masking tape that is, and always has been, immensely satisfying to me. Even though in this particular case, and most other cases where I've used watercolour, the tape has failed and pigment has slipped past the little barrier that I like to put around it, I still think it just looks really cool. Off camera, I removed the salt, which I was a little bit disappointed hadn't done anything, but it is something that I'm keeping tucked in my brain to try on a different project. While I go through and basically just fix up all of the spots where the tape was holding down the masking, I'd like to share something with you that I learned when using watercolour as an adult. For the longest time, I thought that wrinkled paper was just part of working with watercolour, and there was no way to avoid it. But I found out that there are actually techniques artists use to flatten their watercolour artworks when they're finished. And I was pretty impatient to try it and see if it worked for me. Firstly, you place the artwork face down on a clean, flat surface. I like to line the surface with a piece of baking paper because it won't let liquids through, and it also won't move any of the pigment on the artwork. And then you lightly spray the back of the artwork with water, but you don't want to go overboard. You just want it to be slightly damp. And then I placed a few pieces of paper towel on the wet side of the artwork, and then weighed it down with a sheet of ply and stacked a few of my university textbooks on top of it. You're supposed to leave it like that overnight. I'm a very impatient person and don't really like to wait that long, especially if it's something new that I've never tried before and I'm really excited to see if it works. I think the first time I did it, I ended up waiting probably about 4 hours, but it definitely was not long enough. For this one, I think I did it in the morning and then checked it in the early afternoon, and it still worked, but it did need a little bit longer. And now that the watercolour background is finished, I grabbed my Prismacolors again to add the leaves and the branches. To start off with, I block in the areas where the branches and leaves are, since my graphite is now barely visible underneath the watercolour. I used ginger root as the base colour for the branches and sap green light as the base colour for the leaves. And then later on, when I got up to colouring the seed pods, I used artichoke as a base for them. I also fixed up all the space that I left on the rosella's feet so that I would have enough room to have the branch go through. And I was tempted to actually leave it like that because it was very minimalistic, and I think I was just excited to see the branch and the leaves there. With them generating that little bit of interest, it really just had me excited, and I kind of got to that point where I know it's not done, but I'm kind of scared to keep going because it looks so good. At this point, I decided to do the flattening process again because the paper was already starting to warp back into what it had been because I didn't wait long enough. This is about the only use that my university textbooks get, and it's also the only reason why I've kept them since leaving education. And now I get cracking with, and I got brave enough to start adding the detail and shading to the branch. And I focus on using several light layers to blend the pigments and gradually build the colours that I want. I interchange between 70% French grey, moss green, olive green, and artichoke for the darker areas, lime peel, ginger root, Kelly green, and pale sage for the mid-tones, and grey-green light, 20% French grey, ginger root, and white for the highlights. As always, I try to keep my pencil sharp for the more precise areas. But when you're blending, it actually is better to have a blunter pencil because it doesn't push the pigment so hard into the paper. The more I layer on colour, the more pressure I apply because I really wanted these to look smooth. I don't want the texture of the paper to be too distracting. This leaf here is kind of folded into like a bowl, and it's the first time I've really had to try to paint something, draw in this case, something that has a shape that's not flat. Basically, the way that I tried to do this was I focused on putting the darker colours on the inside of the leaf where you can kind of see it curving down. That doesn't make sense. There are spots on the leaves that look like they're sickly or like they've been munched on by something and have started to die off. So for these bits, I actually start using more warm tones with a mix of yellow chartreuse, pumpkin orange, and then I blend those two together with ginger root and yellow ochre to build a gradient from the green to the orangey brown. I also use the yellow ochre and pumpkin orange to add the same effect to some spots on the branches. And where I need to add a little bit more darkness, I use terracotta. And the seed pods are slightly more brown than the leaves, so I add some more warm tones to them too. For the thin wispy branches at the top, I wanted to make them more brown toned than green, so I used a mix of pumpkin orange, yellow ochre, and 50% French grey, basically using them interchangeably to make them appear rounded and to give them subtle wood details. I'm also used the 50% French grey to dull the saturation of the orange because it's not the brightest orange I have, but it's quite noticeably bright against all of the other colours here. Some parts of these branches are actually greener than others, so I work back in with my green tones too. And then I used 70% French grey and terracotta to basically bring a little bit more contrast into the darker areas. I had a lot of fun, and not fun, colouring the leaves. Gum leaves are kind of shiny and often glint in the sunlight, and I'm trying to emulate this while also keeping their green hue, which was actually harder than I expected it to be, and also adding all of the brown spots. It's probably near the first time that I've tried so hard to get the shape and positioning of something accurate to how the light would actually interact with it, and I'm kind of excited to do more of this in the future, even though I didn't really do that with the bird itself. Oh well, hopefully it doesn't look flat. And I forgot to turn on my other light here, so apologies that it's very dark, but you can still mostly see what I was doing. I was really happy after finishing this leaf that the tip of it, which I coloured ages ago, finally felt like it made sense. It did kind of just look like a weird spot on the rosella's neck, and now it kind of has a little bit of a reason to be there. And the whole time I was colouring the leaves, stems and seed pods, I kept having moments when I was more than a little worried that I would do something that would completely ruin the whole piece. I think that's why most people, if they're smart, so not me, will do the background first, because compared to the rest of the bird, a lot less effort went into this part, which I think you can see when you look at the artwork. I'd imagine it's a lot easier to wrestle with the concept of making a mistake when there's not really anything there for you to ruin, and you've got a lot more space to fix it or make adjustments. But I'm very glad I pushed through that insecurity and finished it. A fun fact about this artwork, actually, it is the first artwork that I ever sold. I entered into a local gallery. It was a fundraising event at a gallery 5 minutes up the road from where I live back in July 2025 with 2 artworks, so this one and the wren. I think I haven't mentioned, but this piece was finished on the 2nd of April 2025, so it's been done for quite a while. Let's not mention now, then, that while I'm doing the voiceover for this video, I currently have 40 plus hours of relatively unedited footage waiting from 2 other artworks that I've finished to be turned into videos for you guys. But anyway, back to the gallery. Most of the people who entered had much larger collections than me. It was a little bit of a thing that I was a bit nervous about, but I was kind of a mind that if I don't do it, I'll never know. But if I do it, then I don't know. I was kind of a mind that it was just better to do it than to not do it, even if I didn't have the 10 artworks that I wanted to have. And it was pretty obvious that a lot of the other entrants were more creative and experienced with how they staged their artworks, because their tables were much better decorated than mine. And this is a photo of my setup. I was originally actually planning to film my experience there, but chickened out of that pretty quick. I didn't want people to think that I was some weirdo walking around with a camera, and it also draws a lot more attention to me than what I'm comfortable with. But a lovely man by the name of Landon saw this piece, liked it, and told me that pale-faced rosellas are actually his favourite birds. And then he bought it. I'm still, to this day, incredibly grateful for his support and that we were able to meet that day. And purely just that my art was able to affect someone so much that they actually wanted to spend money on it and buy it. I've given away my artworks as gifts many times in the past, but on this occasion I was fighting with myself to actually let the man pay for it. Regretfully, I was so caught up in the moment that I didn't get the chance to tell him that I recorded the entire process, and that if it interested him, he could actually go onto my YouTube channel and watch the videos of me making it. Maybe one day, hopefully, he'll stumble across my videos and see that I did that. But back to this artwork. I was quite nervous to tackle adding more detail to the seed pods. They've got a range of different colour tones under the green, and I knew I was going to have to experiment with it to get it right. I started by kind of tentatively choosing black raspberry to add a little bit of a purplish brown hue, focusing mainly on the darker areas and using it to bring more shadow to the shadowed parts. And once I started, I felt very silly for being hesitant, but I usually feel pretty silly about most of the insecurities I have about art. I need to have a lot more confidence in myself. I also added some of it to the pod that the Rosella is holding, just to try and bring a little bit more continuity in, and blended it out with the other colours before working in a bit more of a highlight with white. And then I worked back through with my greys, greens and whites with the other seed pods, just to finish them off as well, and I basically used pale sage to blend all of the colours together. And another fun fact, at the time of recording this, I actually wasn't married yet, but I had already designed and been practicing my new signature. My original plan with all these artworks was to get a collection of about 10 native Australian bird pieces and enter them into a gallery up in Mullaney, which is fairly close to where I live on the Sunshine Coast, and I wanted all of them to have the same signature. So I signed with my married signature even though I wasn't married yet. I ended up adding some chestnut to a few spots to lighten the black raspberry, because chestnut's kind of pretty close to a lighter version of the black raspberry, and I used it more heavily on the left pod. And that is this artwork complete. I titled this piece Hanging Pretty and sold the original on the 26th of July 2025. Editing the footage for it and compiling this series reminded me how awesome it was making this piece. Sometimes I find when I finish an artwork I forget all of the little intricate parts that went into making it, and being able to go back and watch over all of it, it's kind of enabled me to relive that experience. Thank you for following along the process, and I really hope you guys enjoy watching it as much as I enjoyed creating it. I'm pretty excited to show you the artworks that I have coming up. You can obviously go onto my Facebook and Instagram to check them out. The next one that I do a video of will be my rainbow lorikeet, kind-eyed rainbow, which is already finished on my Instagram and has been for a while now if you want to go see, as a little sneak peek. But until then, take care, and don't forget to stay inspired.